on the other side. And those clinical systems could be traditional electronic health records that clinicians use, or they could be researcher-focused kind of data warehouse platforms, or they could be patient portals or personal health record systems. Regardless of what those clinical systems look like, these are the basic building blocks that we need to do this integration. So there's a piece that has to do with the user experience. How do we plug an app into an existing system in a way that feels natural and helps users get started very quickly? There's a set of security aspects. So how do we do this with appropriate authorization and single sign-on so that when we plug an app into this EHR system, it gets access to the data that it needs to read from the system. It doesn't get access to the data that it doesn't need. And we don't want to make users create a new account for every different app they want to run. Rather, we'd like to let them sign into an app using their existing EHR account that they've already got, that they're already signed into all day long. And then finally, there's clinical data. And this, of course, is where FHIR comes in. In order for an app to run inside of multiple different EHR systems, it needs a consistent way to request and interact with these clinical data. So SMART is actually an acronym. It stands for Substitutable Medical Applications and Reusable Technologies. And this concept of substitutable is really the core idea here. And what does that mean? Well, if you're a user, it means that you get to pick and choose the apps that work for you. You get access to a broad catalog of applications that can plug into and that are compatible with your EHR system. And you can choose your favorite prescribing tool or your favorite growth chart app or whatever the case may be. And over time, as new apps come out, you can swap out the old ones and switch in a new one and be productive. If you're a developer, this idea of substitutability means that your app has a broader reach. So the barriers to actually building an app that can plug into different EHR systems get much lower, and it actually changes the economics of developing an app. So for example, at Boston Children's Hospital, we wound up building some apps that were sort of at the request of specific departments. So for example, working with the cardiology department, we built a blood pressure app that focused on pediatric blood pressure. Building that kind of app, if it's only ever going to run in one institution, means that the general quality and level of polish is pretty low. You're going to build something that's sort of just good enough for your users within your hospital, and then you're going to stop. Because it wouldn't make sense to invest that much effort to build an app that was going to have a very small audience. But if the audience can get bigger, if you can take that app and redistribute it for free, or if you could sell it to other organizations, depending on what your sort of business model is here, it makes sense to spend more effort building a polished experience. So this really changes the economics for developers. And the big picture is that a modern electronic health record system becomes kind of a platform. It handles the hard things. It handles user management, patient management, handles workflow, it handles record keeping from the perspective of regulatory compliance. It deals with data persistence, and then it gives you a hook point into which you can start building applications. And so as an app developer, you can leave those hard issues to the EHR as a platform, and you can focus on really providing a particular user experience that does a single task and does it well. So we'll be talking about the basic components of the smart health IT platform here, and we'll dig a little bit into the technology, and then I'll show you some demonstrations of some of the tools and systems that we've published to make it easier for developers to get started in this space. So we'll talk a bit about the standards that we use, focusing on FHIR and on OAuth. We'll talk about some of the tools and libraries that we provide, some of the industry support that we're seeing, and then we'll talk a bit about our gallery and some other aspects as well. By all means, please interrupt me with questions or comments as we go. I mean it. Feel free to raise your hand or shout out at any point, and we'll also save some time for questions at the end if we can. So big picture in terms of the standards that we use. Of course, we're using FHIR for the clinical data resources and clinical data API. I won't focus on that because there are many opportunities at this conference to learn all about FHIR. But I will talk a bit more about how we use OAuth for authorization of these apps. And so we'll focus a bit there. Like I said, I'll skip the FHIR overview. But I want to say some things about the way that we use OAuth to plug an app into an EHR system. So the basic idea of OAuth is it's an authorization framework. It's a way to share access with a third-party application or client. So if you're a user of some system and you've got access to data, OAuth gives you a way to share that access with an app of your choice. And in Smart, we define two main flows, or two main ways that you can launch an app with access to clinical data. The first is what we call the EHR or the portal launch. And this is a good workflow to use if what you want to do is provide a clinician or a patient a way to launch your app from inside the context of their existing EHR system. So for example, our growth chart or the blood pressure app that I'll show you, those are designed to run inside of an EHR. And so we use the EHR launch to say, okay, here's a clinician with an EHR session already active, and inside of the context of that session, they want to launch this app. And it'll render inside of their EHR, it'll know about who they are and what patient record they have open, and it'll display in that context. The second example we'll talk about is what we call the standalone launch, which is more relevant if you've got an app that somebody might use. For example, they might have an icon on their mobile phone home screen where they're not starting from the EHR, they're starting from your app and connecting from the EHR once they launch your app. So that's what we call the standalone launch, and we'll talk about the details of how these two pieces work. I'm not going to go into the deep details of the OAuth protocol. Question or comment, please.
So in the EHR or portal launch, the single sign-on is done by OpenID Connect, or how is it?
Yes, so in both of these workflows, your app can ask for a couple of things when it launches. First, it can ask for authorization to access clinical data. And second, it can ask for information about the identity of the user. And that's a single sign-on workflow. For that single sign-on, we use a profile of OAuth called OpenID Connect. That's exactly right. So when you're launching your app, you can say, I need access to some patient data, and I also need to know about the user who's launching me so that I can make sure they're signed into my system. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Other questions about the general space here? All right. So the EHR launch, just to give you a high-level picture, what we're looking at here is two main components. There's an app, and there's an EHR. And this is all about the dance or the interaction between them. So what happens in the EHR launch is you start over here inside of the EHR. You've got a user session already established in step one. And some action triggers the launch of an app. A very common example would be the user clicks a button or a link or chooses a menu item inside of the EHR to navigate to a section of the EHR that is associated with this app. So for example, the user says, I want to run the growth chart app now. Maybe they click on a tab inside the patient record. At that point, the EHR opens up a browser context. It could be an embedded browser or an inline frame, pointing to the application's launch page. The application sees this launch page because it has its web service called there, and it initiates a request back into the EHR to say, hey, it looks like I'm being launched. I need to know the following information. I need certain scopes or permissions in order to access the data to help me do my job. And the EHR, working together with the user, has the opportunity to review that request. It says, okay, I see the growth chart app is now completing its launch. Let's make sure we can provide whatever context we need. And then the EHR returns to the app with a response. It's called an access token response in OAuth. And that comes with the details about the context. It comes with single sign-on details about the user. And it comes with permissions that the app can then use. Those are embedded in what's called an access token. At that point, the app can use the access token to make a FHIR API request to the EHR and say, for example, okay, now I need to know the patient demographics and I need to know a set of recent blood pressures or heights and weights in order to render the app inside of that EHR system. So that's the basics of the EHR launch. It goes from the EHR and calls the app's launch URL to get started. And then the next example I'll show you is going to be like the second steps of this EHR launch. So this is the standalone launch. It starts from the app. So this is the hallmark of the standalone launch is that you're not in the EHR yet, you're just in the app. Maybe you're launching it from your mobile device home screen. But once you're in the app, you as the user say, okay, maybe I'm doing some various tasks inside this app. One thing I want to do is actually view a patient record. Run this app in the context of a specific record. And at that point, the user can connect the app into the EHR, and they'll typically be asked to sign into that EHR system. They may be asked to pick a single patient record if it's the kind of app that works with one patient at a time. And once they make that selection and approve, then they're sent back to the app. So this is the flow where you're starting from the app and getting approval inside of the EHR. But at the end, the result is just the same as we talked about in the EHR launch, which is once it's approved, the app gets an access token, which it can then use over time to request FHIR resources from the EHR system. So that's the basics of the OAuth flow and the two entry points that we define in Smart on FHIR. And I want to say a little bit more about how those permissions work. So when the app makes that request into the EHR for an authorization for a launch, it can provide what we call scopes. And a scope is like a permission. It's a request to say, here's the kind of data I need access to. And in Smart, we define a list of these scopes that allow an app to request these fine-grained permissions. So the convention that we use is if your app is going to run on one patient record at a time, like a growth chart, for example, you're going to ask for scopes that start with the word patient. And that indicates that the scope of access you need is related to one patient record. And then you can decide what FHIR resources you'll need access to. So in the case of an immunizations app, for example, you might ask for read access to the immunization resource. And so the way that you'd say that, if you need access to all the immunizations about the current patient in context, you'd say, I need patient/immunization.read. And you can build up a list of these scopes to express the various kinds of data that your app might need. And in the general case, if you're reading resources across many resource types in a patient record, if you need access to the entire record, you can say patient/star.read to say that you need access to the entire patient record, which for apps that do a lot of detailed work is a pretty common scope. So there's a few examples here. If you're doing an app that's like our growth chart, you might get away with patient.read and observation.read, because those are what you need for the demographics and for the various observations. And not every scope starts with this word patient. So one other thing you might need is access to a whole population worth of patients. So let's say you're building an app that a provider is going to use to query across multiple patients. Maybe they're going to view their schedule for the day, which is going to include data about not just one, but each patient they'll be seeing. So then you can ask for scopes that start with the word user. And what that conveys is, I want all the permissions that this user who's launching the app would have. So you can ask for scopes at the single patient level or at the user level. So I want to talk about a few of the tools that we provide for developers to get started quickly working and building apps in this ecosystem. We'll talk about some software libraries, we'll talk about some web-based sandbox environments, and some of the sample and demonstration apps that we have available. So, question, please.
With the FHIR enabled EHR systems, we get the Smart working with it, but the EHR systems who have HL7 standard, with them not upgraded to FHIR yet. So do we have the internal conversion with the Smart on FHIR library? Is it?
So the question is about EHRs, some of which support FHIR today, and we'll talk about what those are. And then other EHRs don't support FHIR, but they might support HL7 version 2 messaging, for example. And is there some kind of bridge or conversion? I mean, the quick answer is that we don't provide a conversion tool or service trying to translate version 2 messages into FHIR. Our goal is for app developers to plug into EHRs that support Smart on FHIR natively, but there is absolutely an interesting space today for like a third-party integration platform to begin building some of those bridges. It's a pretty big job to do that bridge or conversion from HL7 version 2 into FHIR. It's a hard thing to do totally generically, but in the context of a specific hospital and a specific set of messages, that's absolutely a project that could make sense there. One thing I want to show you on the Smart Health IT website in this regard is under the list here that says Build Apps, there's a link to EHR, FHIR, and Support. This is a web-based tool that shows you for a specific EHR environment which features they support. And by default, I think it's showing you the Epic Sandbox and the Cerner Sandbox and one of the Allscripts EHR environments. So these are 3 systems that have support for Smart on FHIR in their systems today. But you can point it to another system as well and update a list to see which features are supported. The Happy Reference Server, of course, supports all of the resources across the FHIR specification, so you'll see that reflected here in the conformance. But all this tool does is it grabs the server's capability statement or conformance statement, and it shows which individual features of the API are supported by that server. And it does that in real time. So as these systems update their various sandboxes and feature sets, you can get a view of which features are supported inside of that environment. A few words about the software libraries that we provide. So the Smart team hosts libraries in JavaScript and in Python and in Swift that allow you to build a client that can connect to a FHIR server and work with the data. So in those libraries, we take care of the authorization protocols. We take care of providing convenience methods for requesting FHIR data. And then there are other community libraries as well, including in .NET and Ruby for developers who are working in different software stacks. At the end of the day, this is all just standards-based HTTP data exchange. The authorization protocols and the FHIR queries are all just web calls, but it can be very helpful to get started with one of these libraries because it takes care of a lot of the details, both the happy path and the error conditions that can happen. It's good to work with a library that helps you think through those issues. The other point I want to highlight, please, question.
So I guess these libraries are for app developers, not so much for FHIR developers.
Yeah, the libraries that we provide that have the most leverage are for app developers rather than for FHIR developers. Now in this list, there are a couple of common core libraries. So the Happy library and the .NET library are certainly of use for FHIR developers as well. It's very difficult though, especially in terms of mapping the data that you have inside of your FHIR system into this standard practice. In general, FHIR developers are larger and more sophisticated than app developers. So we found that it makes more sense for us to focus on building libraries that are helpful to app developers who may not have the resources to do all of this development in-house. In terms of where you can get your app up and running to try it out, I want to show you some of the resources that we have today. But I'll highlight, so there are some sandboxes that the Smart team hosts with some sample data where you can try your apps out. But there are also sandboxes hosted by the commercial FHIR vendors. And so there's links here in the slides to the Cerner and to the Epic sandboxes, as well as to other organizations. Graham Grieve maintains his own reference implementation of all these specifications as well. And what I will say is, while the goal in Smart is that you can write an app once and plug it into many different environments, the truth is that there are still rough edges and that different environments especially have different conventions about how they host data. They're all compatible with the FHIR API, but the FHIR API has a fair number of options and different ways that you can represent similar information. And so what I'll say is it's really helpful to get started building your app, pick a sandbox and make it run there. But you should expect that when you connect it to the next one or two of these environments, there are going to be places where you'll say, oh, I need to generalize this. I need to be careful about the way that I handle this data because actually there's 3 options, all valid, and I was only thinking about the first one, and it turns out I need to make sure that my app is robust enough to handle all of those cases. Question, please.
So is the retrieval of the data only restricted to the FHIR resource from the FHIR, or can I use my own server and get the data from there?
So the question is whether the retrieval of data is restricted just to the FHIR that you're talking with, or can you bring in outside resources from your own server? I mean, the simple answer here is you're building a web app and you can do anything that the power of the web enables you to do. In terms of what the Smart client libraries and the Smart API helps you with, we're helping you connect to the FHIR as a source of data, but in the general case, the FHIR may just be one source of data for your app. You may actually use these same specifications to connect to 2 different FHIRs, both using the Smart protocol. You may also pull in data by connecting to the Fitbit API, or to your app's own database server that runs under the covers. So the answer is yes, absolutely. Powerful apps pull in data from many places. The focus for Smart is how do you get that connection to an electronic health record. I want to point out links to some open source sample apps that we have, including a blood pressure app that we built for Boston Children's Hospital, as well as a growth chart app. So there's a link from here to some GitHub repositories that contain this information, as well as to the Smart Health IT documentation site, which is the key resource for developers who want to learn how these protocols work and get access to some tutorials, as well as to our sandbox environment. So I won't go through this in detail, but I want to highlight the tutorials tab here, which includes a very simple way to get started building an app in JavaScript, which you can even just host from your own local machine, and links to our sandbox, which is sandbox.smarthealthit.org, which provides a way for you to register your own apps and try them out against a set of sample data. What I will show you quickly is our gallery, so apps.fhir.org. or apps.smarthealthit.org, which is slightly longer to type. This is a resource for developers who are building an app It's not the place to test your app out. That's really what the sandboxes are about. The gallery is a place to publish your work and share it with the world. And the idea is this is a place where developers can, where users can come and discover what apps are available. What we're seeing is that specific EHR vendors, they have their own stores or places where you can go and learn about which apps are supported by your vendor. But the Smart Health IT, this Smart App Gallery, is a place where you can learn about apps across the ecosystem. And it provides a way for users to browse by category, as well as by specific EHR support, and you can learn about the licensing models and the fee structures for some of these apps as well. I'll give you just a quick tour from the perspective of understanding how these apps work. You can browse in the featured apps category, for example, and see a set of apps, some of which are open source apps that we've developed, many of which are commercial apps that have been developed by the outside world. And I was going to show you an example of one of these apps, which was built by the group at Polyglot Systems called Medication. This is an app that does translations for medication instructions. So what the gallery does is it gives developers a way to have a simple description for their app, include screenshots or videos, and information about where the app runs and who the target audience is. The cool feature that I wanted to show you, though, is the Try It button, or Try App button. And this allows a potential user to see how this app runs against the sandbox without having to sign in or create an account or do anything other than perhaps just pick a patient record out of our list of sample patients. And so what you'll see in this example is that once I've picked a patient record, we'll see with the challenges of a live demo here, once I've picked a patient record, the app will launch. It'll go through the entire authorization process that we talked about under the hood. So as a user, I don't see anything, I don't have to take any steps. But the app will then get access to the patient record. And in this case, it's an app that focuses on translations of medication instructions. So the core competency of the Polyglot team is translating medication instructions into many different languages. And just to give you an example, you can pull up any drug from the patient's medication list. So that's been fetched through the Smart API. And they'll provide handouts in English or over 15 other languages that allow you to generate instructions for a patient in a language that they speak. So if you're sending a patient home from the emergency department with instructions for how to take an antibiotic, you can actually give them instructions that are tailored for their native language, and they've got a good shot at being able to read and understand those instructions. So that's an example of the way that the Try It link works. And if you're building an app and sharing it with the world, you can allow users to try it from within our app gallery. You don't have to enable that feature, but it's an option, and it's one that we recommend as a best practice to help users really get a feel for what your app is like and how it works. So that's a quick view of the app gallery. I showed you some of our EHR FHIR support. Let me see if there's questions at this point as we're coming towards the end of the session. Can I answer questions about tools we provide, how the specifications work, or anything else? Please.
Are all FHIR versions supported, or only one or two?
So the question is about FHIR version support. Our sandbox supports FHIR DSTU2 and FHIR STU3. Most of our sample apps also support both of those versions, although there are some apps that have not yet been upgraded to STU3. In general, the Smart on FHIR specification is designed to be compatible with many versions of the FHIR specification. So the way that we do OAuth, the way that we do OpenID Connect, the single sign-on piece, that's all independent of the FHIR version. And that way we can have one specification for how that Smart App launch works, compatible with multiple FHIR versions. Please.
If I want to connect to multiple sources, then we're using Smart on FHIR. Then I have to take into account that I have to go through the authorization, identification, and the token process for each source, don't I?
Yes, the question is if you want to connect to multiple sources of data, do you have to go through this authorization process and this whole launch multiple times? And the answer is yes. The focus in Smart has been helping an app launch against one EHR at a time. And if what you want to do in your app is actually connect to multiple different Smart compatible EHRs, then yes, you would have to go through that process multiple times within the context of a single launch. As far as Smart is concerned, you're actually launching your app twice, once against System A and once against System B. It is a pattern that we have seen developers implement, but I'll say that there are other patterns which can also be powerful at the organizational level. So for example, if you're working in the context of one health system and you've got two different EHRs, it can be a powerful thing, rather than pushing this onto every app developer to understand the difference between these two systems, it can be very powerful to build a bridge between them and say, we're going to integrate the data at the level of this bridge, and then the app can launch against that bridge system rather than having to launch independently against each underlying system. So there are a lot of trade-offs here in the design, and to your point, the question is always, what does the user have to go through? What user-facing steps are we forcing on someone in order to get the value out of running these apps? There always has to be a compelling proposition.
If you're introducing a bridge, you have to introduce identification, authentication, authorization on the bridge.
Yes, so building a bridge system like that is not a trivial undertaking. It's a big job. It's an investment. We've seen some organizations go down this path with successful results, but you're absolutely right. That's a real undertaking. Question?
Yeah, so we see, like the medical doctors, for example, they very often have to relate to many different types of applications during a workflow. So they have to do some here and they have to do some there. And this, in a way, potentially creates silos of applications that you have to go through. Do you have any sort of thoughts on how you could make this more seamless across applications?
Sure. So in the context of a clinical workflow that involves many applications, you may be siloing activities in one or another, and how can we make this more seamless? So yeah, a couple of high-level thoughts. And the first is that I think we have gone a long way with single-purpose apps that help you get one job done at a time. And if you look at the way people interact with apps on their mobile phones, for example, it's pretty common to switch explicitly between apps pretty often. And people do manage to keep this straight. That said, I think there are some real opportunities to help orchestrate steps between apps. So one project that I've helped with is a project called Clinical Decision Support Hooks, which is about recommending, which among other things, is about recommending when a particular app might be a good option for the user. And so in the context of a clinical workflow, being able to say, oh, this app would be a good one for you right now. And so that's a technology that can help provide more guidance and help bridge a more seamless interaction between one app and the EHR, so you know when it's appropriate to launch each app. But I'll say this is also an area of research, and in particular, how to coordinate between multiple apps so that an app can, for example, send a message to another app is not something that we've tried to specify yet in these APIs. I think it'll be a fruitful area for research once we have support for this one app at a time paradigm.
Thanks.
Yeah, please.
Hi, have you seen or attempted to use this alongside a national identity provider, for example? So if you had a national single sign-on solution giving out identity tokens, could you then use those identity tokens against each of the authorization endpoints to give it consistent? Yeah,
so the question is, what if you had a national identity service? Could you do more consistent implementation of these apps by connecting to that service? So the answer is yes, but there's a couple of parts to that. One thing that you could try to do in the context of a national identity service is get each electronic health record system to rely on that national service. Another thing that you could do is to say, well, actually, each system has its own identity, and I'll learn about that, and also I'll learn about the national identity, so that an app would connect to the EHR and to the national identity service. I would say that if you can swing it, the first is a lot more attractive. If you can get each EHR system, or many EHR systems, to rely on that national identity, you avoid a lot of headache downstream. But in practice, getting that kind of wide agreement is a real challenge. 5 minutes left. Other questions or comments? Yeah?
Do all EHR vendors support the standalone launch? Is that something optional they can shy away from?
So the question is, do all EHR vendors support the standalone launch? Is that optional? So one thing that we're working on right now is bringing these specifications, the Smart App Launch specification, through the HL7 standardization process. So when we developed this, we did it through the Smart Health IT group at Harvard Medical School, and it was a community process, but it wasn't a standards process. One thing that we're doing right now is working through exactly what you just described, which is listing all these capabilities and trying to package them up and saying, here's how an EHR can advertise its support for this set of capabilities or that set of capabilities. So the answer today is that most of the commercial implementations support the EHR integrated launch, and they have variable support for standalone launch, in particular when it comes to that patient picker. So in general, you can launch with a standalone launch and get user-level permissions, but not all the systems allow you to launch your app and get the EHR system to display a patient picker during the launch. So that's an example of a place where we have some variability in support. Other questions, comments? All right. Let me give you a sneak peek of a development tool that we've been working on in the Smart Health IT group. This has not launched yet, so I'm going to call this a pre-alpha. One sec while I type. So this is a tool called the Smart App Launcher. We're planning to announce this next week, but as a sneak preview since you're here at the FHIR DevDays, the goal here is to make it easier for app developers to test out their apps without having to go and register for a Sandbox account and go through a complex workflow. So this is a one-page, single-page app where you as a developer can say, what kind of launch type do you want to try out? Do you want to try out the EHR launch? Do you want to try out a standalone launch? Do you want to build a back-end service that runs just in a business-to-business connection? What version of FHIR are you interested in using? If you're going to build an app with that needs a single patient, let's decide that up front. Let's decide which patient is going to be in scope so that I can construct a launch that's all ready to go. You select all the options that you need, and then at the bottom of the screen, you get a FHIR service URL that is specific to all the details that you just put together. So all the decisions that I just made about what kind of launch and which patient I want to be in context, they're all packed into this URL. And then you can test out your app using this as your base URL, which allows you to simulate various conditions, not just which patient you want to pick, but you can also simulate various error conditions as well to make sure that your app behaves well in the case where maybe you get an invalid token or you have an expired token. This allows you to test any one of these conditions just by changing up the FHIR server URL or the base URL that gets generated for you based on all the inputs you provided. And then in the context of this tool, all the decisions that you made, you can just bookmark them. They're all baked into the URL of the page that we're viewing right now so that you can share this with other developers on your team and they can try out exactly the same workflow that you're trying out. So this is a new tool that we're working on called the Smart App Launcher. And you can look forward to an announcement on this one, I hope next week, but there's a sneak preview of what's coming. With that, I will close. I'm going to be around for the whole conference, so happy to dig in and talk through use cases at any point. Thank you.